The wind came down off the Wind River Range that December morning, the way it always did in the high country, slow and patient and cold enough to crack a man's lungs if he breathed too deep. Snow had been falling for 3 days without a pause, and the pines stood draped in white like mourners at a funeral that never ended. Eli Kane stood beneath one of those pines, 35 years old, broad-shouldered with a beard the color of rust, gone to silver at the edges, and a scar that ran from his left temple down across his cheekbone and disappeared into the line of his jaw. He stood without moving, the way a man stands when he is alone with something holy. In front of him was a stone, just a stone, gray and weathered, set into the frozen ground beneath the oldest tree on the ridge. He had carved the words himself 8 winters ago with hands that trembled so badly the chisel had slipped twice and drawn blood. The words were these: Eleanor Ashford, 1864 to 1881, the one I waited for. Eli reached into the pocket of his sheepskin coat and drew out a small dried flower, an edelweiss the color of old paper, brittle as a dead man's promise. He bent down on one knee in the snow and laid the flower against the stone. He did this every month. He had done it every month for 96 months. The flower would freeze tonight and the wind would take it by morning, but he came anyway. A man keeps his word even to a ghost. Beside him, old Boone, the gray hunting hound he had raised from a pup, lowered his graying muzzle and pressed it gently against the back of Eli's hand. The dog was 12 years old now. His joints ached in the cold, and he no longer chased deer the way he once had, but he still walked this hill every month with his master, and he still understood in the way that good dogs always understand that this place was sacred, and silence was the only proper sound a creature could make here. Eli stayed kneeling for a long time. Then he stood because the cold was working its way into the old wound on his back, and he turned and walked down the ridge with Boone beside him. He did not know it then. He could not have known it. But that grave he had been tending for 8 years was about to be opened, not in the earth, but in his heart. And the woman buried inside it was about to walk through his cabin door. There are men who bury their wives in the ground. Eli Kane had buried a woman he had never touched, never kissed, never even seen face to face, except in a small ivory portrait, the size of his palm. He did not know yet that the worst lie of his life was about to be undone, and that the second worst lie was about to begin. To understand what happened that December, you must go back 10 years to the spring of 1879. Eli had come home from the Indian Wars in the autumn of 76, 22 years old, and carrying scars he never spoke of. He had ridden under General Crook in a column that arrived too late to save Custer at the Little Bighorn, and he had seen things on those plains that no young man should see. He had ridden in only one campaign the bitter summer of 76, but one was enough. The scar on his face came from a Lakota lance that nicked him in a skirmish near the Rosebud. He had been lucky, the surgeon told him. 2 inches lower and you would have lost the eye. 2 inches lower and you would have lost everything. He came back to the cabin his father had built on the slopes of the Wind River in 75, and he tried to remember how to be a man who did not flinch at every snapping branch. His mother saw it in him. Mothers always see it. She told his father, "Your son needs a wife, Thomas. He needs something to live for besides ghosts." His father wrote letters. The Kane family had distant cousins back east in the timber country of Pennsylvania, and through them they made contact with a Reverend Cyrus Ashford, a widower preacher in a small town outside of Greenbrier. The Reverend had a daughter 15 years old named Eleanor. She was bookish, the letters said, quiet, obedient. too young yet to marry, but in 2 or 3 years she would be of an age, and the Reverend was a man who appreciated the practical advantages of an arrangement. The Kane Ranch had land. Eleanor had nothing but her mother's small inheritance, a silver mine in Colorado, that the Reverend was holding in trust until she came of age. Eli wrote his first letter to Eleanor in the spring of '79. She was 15. He was 25. He did not expect to fall in love with a girl he had never met. He did not expect anything at all. But she wrote back. She wrote about the autumn leaves in Pennsylvania, how they turned the color of fire, and how she walked through them on the way to the schoolhouse where she was learning to teach. She wrote about a book she had read called Walden by a man named Thoreau, and she asked Eli if there were ponds in Wyoming, and were they as still as the ones in Massachusetts. She wrote about her mother who had died when she was 8, and how she still kept her mother's hairbrush on the dresser even though her father had told her to put it away. She wrote in a hand that slanted slightly to the right, and her letters had a smell to them faint, like dried lavender. Eli kept every one of them. He read them in the lamplight of his bedroom on the eastern side of the cabin, the one with the small window that looked out over the pines, and slowly, page by page, he began to understand that he was falling in love with a girl he had never seen. In the spring of '81, the Reverend wrote that Eleanor was now 17, and although that was a year younger than they had originally agreed upon, certain financial pressures made it advisable to move the wedding forward. She would travel by rail to Miller's Crossing, the closest railhead to the Kane land. Eli was to meet her there and bring her home. They would be married by the circuit preacher within the week. Eli rode down to Miller's Crossing on the 1st of June, 1881. He brought a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked himself and a small ivory portrait of Eleanor that her father had sent the year before, a likeness done by a traveling painter when she was 16. He sat in the lobby of the only hotel in town, and he waited. He waited 1 day. He waited 2 days. On the 3rd day, a Western Union boy came into the lobby with a yellow envelope, and he looked around at the half-dozen men in the room, and he said, "Anyone here named Kane?" Eli stood up. The telegram was 3 lines long. Eleanor took fever sudden. Eleanor passed 2 days ago. There will be no wedding. Reverend Cyrus Ashford. Eli did not remember reading it a second time. He did not remember walking out of the hotel. He remembered only the wooden boards of the railway platform splintered and cold beneath his knees, and the sound of his own breath coming out of him in something that was not quite a sob and not quite a scream. He had cried once in his life as a man, and that was the day. He did not cry again for 8 years. He rode back to the cabin. He told his mother and his father and his brothers and his sister, and his mother held him the way she had held him when he was 6 and broken his arm falling out of the hayloft. Then he carved a stone, and he set it under the old pine on the ridge above the cabin, and he wrote on it the only words that mattered, "The one I waited for." 6 months later, in the dead of winter, his father and mother both took the lung fever that swept through the high country in the fall of '81. They were buried before Christmas side by side on the same ridge as Eleanor's empty grave. Eli, 27 years old, became the head of the Kane family. That was the year he stopped speaking unless he had to. That was the year he locked the wooden trunk in his bedroom and put the key on a leather cord around his neck and never took it off even to sleep. Inside the trunk were 2 things: the ivory portrait and every letter she had ever written to him. Now it was December of 1889. 8 years had passed since the worst summer of his life. Eli was 35, and his beard was going silver at the edges. and the only sound in his world most days was the wind in the pines and the breathing of an old gray dog. He had 2 brothers and a sister. The sister Ruth had married a kind man named Hawthorne, who ran the general store in Cedar Hollow, 3 hours' ride down the mountain. She visited the cabin once every few weeks, bringing supplies and gossip, and her ceaseless worry that her oldest brother was wasting his life. Eli loved her for it. He never told her so. The middle brother was Jasper, 33 years old, dark-haired, broad in the shoulder, the best scout and tracker in the Wind River country. Jasper was the one who kept the family laughing. He had a way of finding humor in the worst weather and the leanest hunts, and he could play the banjo their father had carried west from Tennessee. He was also, though he never made a show of it, the fastest hand with a pistol of any man Eli had ever ridden with, faster even than some of the soldiers Eli had served with in '76. The youngest brother was Silas, 30 years old, sandy-haired, green-eyed, a blacksmith and a carpenter, and a man of few words and steady hands. Silas had built half the furniture in the cabin himself. He was engaged to be married in the spring to a young woman named Adelaide Larkin, the daughter of the storekeeper next to Ruth's husband's place. Silas loved Adelaide with a quiet completeness that Eli envied the way one envies a sunrise from inside a dark room. The 3 brothers lived together in the cabin their father had built. They hunted, they trapped, they shoed horses, they shaped iron. They had survived the death of their parents by the only means 3 young men know, which is by leaning on each other until the leaning became a habit, and the habit became a love that none of them ever named out loud. That December morning, after Eli had walked down from the ridge with Boone at his heels, he came in through the back door of the cabin and stamped the snow off his boots and set his Winchester rifle on the table to oil it. He did not know that his sister was already on the road from Cedar Hollow. He did not know that the wagon she was driving carried 2 passengers instead of 1. He did not know that the second passenger was a young woman wrapped in a thin wool coat that should never have been worn in such cold, and that her hair beneath her bonnet was the color of autumn leaves. He did not know that the dead were about to come home. The first one to hear the wagon was Jasper. He was outside splitting wood, and he heard the bells on the harness before he saw the horses come around the bend in the trail. He set down his axe and walked to the porch. Silas was inside at the kitchen stove, brewing coffee that could strip the paint off a barn door. Eli was at the table with his rifle. Ruth's wagon came up to the cabin in a slow, careful approach, the horses blowing steam, the runners hissing on the packed snow. Ruth climbed down first, 28 years old, with her dark hair pinned beneath a fur cap, and she turned and reached up to help someone else down. The someone else was a woman, slim, smaller than Ruth, and she stepped down with the careful uncertainty of a person who has not eaten enough for too long. Jasper saw her face when she lifted it to look at the cabin. He stopped breathing. "Lord God Almighty," he whispered so low that no one heard him. He did not know why he said it. He only knew that the face under the bonnet was the face of someone he should not be seeing on this side of the grave. Silas came out behind him holding 2 tin cups of coffee, and Silas felt something he could not name, a sort of recognition without memory, as if he had heard a song long ago and forgotten the words, but remembered the tune. Inside the cabin, Eli was still at the table. Ruth led the woman up the porch steps. The woman was shivering, and Ruth had her arm around her shoulders. Boone, who had been lying by the fire, lifted his gray head as the door opened, and then he did something he had not done in 8 years. He stood up. He walked across the cabin. He went directly to the woman in the doorway, and he pressed his head against the side of her hand, the way he only ever did with Eli. The woman gasped softly. She bent down and touched the dog's ear. Boone closed his eyes. Jasper looked at Silas. Silas looked at Jasper. Neither of them spoke. Boone had never gone to a stranger like that, not once in his entire life. The woman straightened up. She looked into the cabin and her eyes found Eli at the table. She drew a breath. She said, "My name is Nora Bramwell." Eli had been polishing the breech of his rifle. The cloth was in his right hand and the rifle was across his lap. When she said her name, the cloth fell. The rifle fell after it hitting the table with a heavy wooden clatter that should have made everyone in the room jump. No one jumped. They were all looking at Eli. He was looking at the woman. Her hair beneath the bonnet was the color of autumn leaves. Her eyes were the pale blue-gray of a winter sky just before the sun comes over the eastern ridge. Her cheekbones were high and her mouth was small and serious, and there was a tiredness in her face that no 25-year-old woman should have earned yet. She was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen in his life. She was also Eleanor Ashford. Eli stood up too fast. The crown of his head struck the low pine beam that ran across the kitchen, and the impact sent a flash of white light across his vision. He stumbled. Ruth said, "Eli, are you all right?" He did not answer. He pushed past her and past the woman and out onto the porch and down the steps into the snow, and he stood there bareheaded with his coat unbuttoned and his hands shaking and the cold biting at his bare neck, and he tried to make his lungs work. "She is dead," he told himself. "Eleanor died 8 years ago. The telegram came on the 3rd day. I read it twice. I read it 100 times. She is dead and buried, and this is some other woman who only looks like her. It is a coincidence. It is a trick of the light. It is the snow playing on my eyes." But his hands shook, and he knew. He knew the way a man knows his own hand in the dark. He stood out there for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only 3 or 4 minutes. When he turned and went back inside, his face was composed, and his hands were still. He had been a soldier once. He still knew how to put on a face, Ruth was explaining. The woman Nora was a school teacher who had been teaching for 3 years at the small one-room school in Cedar Hollow. The mining company had pulled out in October when the silver vein played out and half the families in town had left, and the school had closed because there were no more children. The boarding house had given Nora until the end of November, and the end of November had come and gone, and then yesterday afternoon, Ruth had gone down to the train platform to meet her husband's freight order, and there she had found a young woman sitting alone on a bench with a small carpet bag at her feet, and no ticket, because the next eastbound train was not until April when they cleared the pass. She was going to walk, Ruth said almost in tears. She was going to walk 40 miles through the pass in December. She would have died brothers. She would have frozen in the first night. Nora stood by the fire with her hands folded in front of her. She did not beg. She did not weep. She held herself the way a deer holds itself when it knows it is being watched, perfectly still and ready to bolt. Her chin was up. Her eyes were on the floor. Jasper said, "Of course she can stay. We've got the spare room. She can have it as long as she needs." Silas nodded. "We can manage. Plenty of room here." Eli stood in the doorway and looked at the woman who could not be Eleanor, and who was Eleanor, and he heard his own voice come out of his throat from somewhere very far away. "One winter," he said, "until the thaw. Then she goes." It was the cruelest thing he had ever said to a woman, and the kindest he could manage. Nora dipped her head and whispered her thanks. She did not look at him. She had no way of knowing that the man with the scar on his face was the man she had been engaged to 10 years ago, the man whose name she had whispered every night for 8 years into a pillow that smelled of lavender and grief. That night, Nora slept on a folding cot by the front room hearth, with one of Ruth's quilts pulled up to her chin. Old Boone, who had not slept anywhere but at the foot of Eli's bed in 9 years, lay down beside the cot and did not move. Eli went into his bedroom. He locked the door. He took the leather cord from around his neck, and he opened the wooden trunk for the first time in 3 months. He lifted out the ivory portrait. He held it in his palm, and he held it next to the memory of the face he had just seen, and he understood. He understood with the cold and final clarity that comes once or twice in a man's life. The girl in the portrait was 16. The woman in his front room was 25. They were the same person. She had not died. She had not died. He sank to his knees on the floor of his own bedroom, the portrait in one hand and a stack of old letters in the other, and he tried to make sense of a world in which the dead did not stay dead. 8 years, he whispered. 8 years I knelt on that ridge. 8 years I carried this thing around my neck. 8 years I told myself God had taken her from me. And she has been alive the whole time. Alive somewhere, working, reading, sleeping, breathing. And now she is in my front room. Why is she here? Why does she call herself Bramwell? What has been done to her in those 8 years? What was done to me? Boone came through the door, which had not latched properly. The old dog walked to him and pressed his head against Eli's chest. Eli wrapped his arms around the gray neck and shook silently for a long time, and the dog, who had waited 8 years with him for something neither of them could have named, waited a little longer. The first week was a small kind of hell. Nora made herself useful. She rose before dawn, lit the kitchen stove, kneaded bread dough on the floured table, and scrubbed the floorboards of the front room until the pine grains shone. She mended a tear in Jasper's wool shirt without being asked. She brushed the burrs out of Boone's coat. She did everything she could to earn the place she had been given, because she had been raised by a man who had taught her that a woman's worth was measured only in her usefulness, and it was the only currency she knew how to spend. Jasper made her laugh on the second day. He came in stamping the snow off his boots and announced that he had just seen a rabbit so large it could have pulled a sled, and Nora's mouth lifted at one corner, and Jasper swore later to Silas that he had seen the sun come into the cabin. Silas, who saw her as a younger sister from the moment she stepped through the door, fixed the squeaky hinge on her bedroom door and oiled it twice, and made sure her water pitcher was filled with hot water every morning before she rose. Silas thought of Adelaide when he saw Nora, and he thought of how soon his own wedding would come, and his kindness toward Nora was the kindness of a man who knows what it is to be a stranger in love. Eli avoided her. He rose before she did, and he went into the woods, and he stayed out until after dark. He took meals at odd hours. He spoke in monosyllables. When she passed him in the narrow hall, he stepped back to let her by without meeting her eyes. Nora began to believe in the silent way that women believe such things, that he hated her. She did not know why. She thought perhaps he resented the burden, or perhaps he disliked having a woman in the house at all, or perhaps there was something about her face that displeased him. She did not weep over it because she had been taught long ago not to weep where any man could see. But she lay awake at night in the cot by the hearth, and she felt the weight of his coldness like a hand on her chest. On the seventh morning she rose earlier than usual and made tea and carried a cup of it out onto the porch to drink in the gray dawn. Eli came up the path from the woods carrying a rabbit slung over his shoulder. He saw her, and for the first time in 7 days he did not look away. She set down her cup. She said very softly, "What have I done that has made you unhappy with me?" He stopped on the lowest step. His mouth opened. He almost told her then. He almost said her name. Eleanor. He almost crossed the porch and dropped to his knees and laid his head in her lap and wept the 8 years of weeping he had not allowed himself. Instead, he said, "It is not your doing. It is no one's doing." And he walked past her into the cabin. She stood on the porch with her cooling tea and tried to understand what had just happened. She understood nothing, but she remembered later that for the first time he had spoken to her gently. The 9th day brought an unexpected encounter that neither of them had planned for. Eli had been out cutting firewood, and he came in through the back kitchen sweating despite the cold, and he stripped off his outer shirt and his undershirt to wash at the basin by the stove. He was leaning over the basin, sluicing cold water over his face and chest, when Nora came through the swinging door from the front room with a basket of laundry. She stopped. His back was to her. She saw the long, pale scar that ran down across his shoulder blade, and another that wrapped around the curve of his ribs. She had read enough penny novels in her life to recognize what made a scar like that. A blade. A long one. He felt her there the way a man does. He turned slowly. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other in the steam of the kitchen. She did not turn away, though her cheeks colored. He did not reach for the shirt on the chair behind him. There was no shame between them, only the quiet recognition of two people who had each been wounded in ways the other had not earned the right to ask about. He said, "The Indian Wars." 76. I was 22. She said, "I do not think serving your country is something to hide." He looked at her for a long time. "You are the first person," he said, "who has ever told me that. In 13 years. She set down the basket. She came 2 steps toward him and then stopped because she did not know what she had been intending to do. She nodded once, slowly. Then she turned and went back through the swinging door. Eli stood at the basin a long time after she was gone. He understood with a clarity he did not welcome that his heart had begun to beat again. After 8 years of silence, it had simply started up like an old clock that someone had wound. And the woman who had wound it was the very woman he had spent those 8 years mourning. And he could not tell her who she was because he did not yet know why she was using a false name. That afternoon, he and Jasper went out into the woods together to track a buck that had been working a meadow on the far side of the ridge. They walked for a long time in silence on the snow, their breath making white plumes, the only sound the soft squeak of the powder under their boots. Then Jasper said, "Brother, do you know who she is?" Eli almost dropped his rifle. "I saw the portrait in your trunk," Jasper said quietly. "I was 18. You were in the barn. I picked the lock with a hairpin because I was a foolish boy and I was curious about what you were guarding. I am sorry. I never told you. But I know that face. The girl in your trunk and the woman in our kitchen are the same woman." Eli stopped walking. He stared straight ahead into the white trees. "Yes," he said. Jasper took a breath. "What are you going to do?" "I do not know. She does not remember me. She does not know who I am. She is calling herself Bramwell, not Ashford. That means she is hiding from someone. Probably her father, though he has been dead for 5 years according to the papers. Whatever she is running from, she is running from it hard enough to take a false name." Jasper said, "Brother, Do you really believe God brought her to this cabin after 8 years, just so you could send her down the mountain in April with a polite handshake?" Eli did not answer. They walked on. But Jasper had planted the seed. The 12th day broke clear and cold, and Nora woke up with a fever. By mid-morning she could not stand. By afternoon she could not speak. The exposure at the train station, the cold nights in the boarding house, the long walk through November snow in a coat too thin, all of it had finally caught up with her. Silas saddled his fastest horse and rode the 3 hours down the mountain to fetch the doctor. Jasper kept the fire roaring. Eli sat by the bed with a basin of cool water and a cloth, and he wiped her forehead and her wrists and the hollow of her throat as she shook and burned beneath the quilts. She mumbled in her fever. At first it was only fragments, soft sounds, broken pieces. Then, near midnight, she began to speak in words. "Eli," she said. He froze. The cloth in his hand went still. "Eli Kane," she whispered. "Where are you?" "I am sorry. I could not come. He told them I was dead. Father told them I was dead. I am sorry. I am sorry." The cloth slid from Eli's fingers and dropped into the basin. The water sloshed. Nora, who was deep in her fever, did not hear it. She turned her face on the pillow, and her hand reached out blindly and found his hand and gripped it. Eli felt the second tear of his entire adult life roll down the scarred side of his face. He did not wipe it away. He bent close to her ear, and he said in a voice so quiet that even Boone, who lay at the foot of the bed, could barely hear it. "I am here. I have been here. I waited, Eleanor. I waited for you." She did not hear him. She was very far away in some country of fever and old grief, but her fingers tightened on his. He sat with her all night. The fever broke just before dawn. When she opened her eyes in the gray light, she did not remember anything she had said. She only saw the man with the scar sitting in the chair beside her bed, and she saw the deep exhaustion in his face, and she said, "You stayed." He said, "I will always stay." She did not understand the answer. She drifted back to sleep. Eli left the room and went to the kitchen and poured himself coffee and stood at the window with both hands wrapped around the tin cup, and he watched the sun come up over the Wind River. Today, he thought, today I will tell her. Today I will open the trunk and show her the portrait and the letters, and I will tell her my name, and I will ask her to forgive me for the 8 years I spent burying her when she was alive in the world and waiting for me too. He had just made that promise to himself when he heard a horse coming up the trail at a hard gallop. It was Ruth. She came up to the cabin lathered with sweat despite the cold, her hair half down from its pins, and she swung off the saddle without waiting for help. She came up onto the porch, shaking. "Eli," she said. "Eli, there is a man in Cedar Hollow. He came in on the morning stage. He is asking after a missing girl, a red-haired woman, 25 years old, traveling under the name Bramwell, but truly named Eleanor Ashford. He says her father has hired him. He says the family will pay for her safe return. He has been showing a tintype of her in the saloon. Half the town has seen it." Eli stood very still on the porch with his sister in front of him, and his sleeping wife in the bedroom behind him, and his old gray dog at his heel, and his 2 brothers coming up from the barn at the sound of Ruth's horse, and he understood that the 8 years of silence had just ended. The dead had come home, and someone else had come looking for them. Eli looked at Ruth. He looked at Jasper and Silas, who were stopping in the snow at the foot of the steps with their hands on their belts and their faces gone hard. He said, "Get the rifles. Get them all." Then he turned and walked back into the cabin, where the woman he had buried 8 years ago lay sleeping in his brother's bed, and he closed the door behind him, and he went to her side, and he sat down to wait for whatever was coming up the mountain next. Eli sat in the chair beside the bed for a long time after he closed the door. Outside the window, the snow had stopped falling, and the morning sun came through the pines in thin gold lines that fell across the floorboards and across the foot of the quilt, and across the pale hand of the woman who had once been Eleanor Ashford. She slept the deep sleep of a body that has burned through its fever and come out the other side. Her breathing was slow. Her cheeks had the faintest color in them now, like the inside of a seashell. He looked at her hand. He looked at his own. 12 years of frontier weather and 3 years of cavalry leather and a lifetime of axe handles had left his fingers blunt and scarred and the color of saddle leather. Her fingers were thin and pale, and on the third finger of her left hand she wore no ring at all. He thought about that for a while. Then he thought about the man in the saloon with her tintype. Then he stood up because there were things to do that could not wait for grief. He went to the kitchen. Ruth was standing at the stove with her back very straight, pouring coffee, with hands that shook only a little. Jasper was leaning against the doorframe with his rifle across his arms. Silas had come in through the back and was already strapping on his belt, the sandy hair across his forehead damp with sweat from his ride down off the ridge. Eli closed the bedroom door behind him. He said, "Before we go any further, there is something the three of you have to know." He took a breath. He let it out. "The woman in that bedroom," he said, "is not Nora Bramwell. She never was. Her real name is Eleanor Ashford. She is the woman I was supposed to marry in Miller's Crossing in 1881. She is the woman whose telegram I got. She is the woman whose grave I have been tending for 8 years. The kitchen went very quiet. Ruth set the coffee pot down on the stove without looking at it. Her hand went up to her mouth. "Eli," she whispered. Jasper did not look surprised because Jasper had already known. He simply nodded once and said, "Then we are done waiting. We are going to fight for her." Silas took a long moment. He looked at his oldest brother for a long time. Then he said, "Then her father lied. The Reverend lied. He sent the telegram that buried you alive for 8 years, and now he wants her back, because he wants her mother's silver mine." Eli nodded. Ruth said, "But the man in the saloon. He said her father has hired him. Her father has been dead for 5 years. "Then her father is not dead," Eli said. "Then her father faked his own death probably to escape his creditors, and now that the silver mine is coming to market, he needs her signature to sell it. She is the only legal heir, and he has come back from the grave to take her." Silas said, "Cheyenne." Eli looked at him. "I will ride to Cheyenne," Silas said. "I will find Caleb Henderson. He used to be a circuit judge. He owes me 3 favors. He will draw up papers. He will write affidavits. We will make a paper trail that will reach a federal courthouse if we have to. If her father comes up this mountain, we will not meet him with rifles only. We will meet him with the law." Eli looked at his youngest brother and felt for one moment the way a father feels when he sees that his son has become a man without him noticing. He nodded. "Take the bay mare. She has the wind for it." Silas was on the road within the hour. That night, Eli went to her bedroom door and knocked. She called for him to come in a voice still weak from the fever. He brought a tray with broth and bread and a tin cup of weak coffee. He set it on the table by the bed. He took the chair he had sat in for 2 nights, and he turned it so that he could face her, and he sat down. She had her hair down and the autumn red of it spread on the pillow behind her. She looked at him with eyes the color of dawn over snow, and she said, You have been very kind to me." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Eleanor." The cup was halfway to her lips. It stopped. She did not lower it. She did not move. She only looked at him, and the color went out of her face very slowly, like wine running out of a tilted glass. He said, "My name is Elias Kane. I waited for you in Miller's Crossing in June of 1881. I waited 3 days. On the 3rd day, your father sent a telegram. I have it still. It said you were dead. I rode home and I carved you a stone under the old pine on the ridge above this cabin. I have laid an Edelweiss flower on it every month for 96 months. I never knew that the man who wrote that telegram was a liar. I never knew that you were alive somewhere in the world, alive and breathing and walking and reading while I was kneeling in the snow, whispering to a stone." She set the cup down on the tray. The tin made a small, clear sound against the wood. For a long moment she did not speak. Then, very slowly, she pushed back the quilt. She got out of bed in her nightdress and her bare feet. She crossed the room to the small leather valise that Ruth had brought up from Cedar Hollow, the one she had carried with her on the train and had never let out of her sight. She knelt by it. She unbuckled the straps. She lifted the lid. She reached down to the bottom of it. She brought out a small bundle of letters tied with a piece of brown ribbon. She came back to the bed and sat down on the edge of it, and she held the letters out to him. "These," she said, "are the letters you wrote to me." He took them. The ribbon was old. The letters underneath it were yellow at the edges and creased from much handling. He recognized his own hand on the front of the topmost one, the slant of it the way he had always made his C with a deliberate flourish because his mother had told him a man's signature was the first thing the world saw of him. He looked up. She said my father kept them. He hid them in a locked cabinet behind his pulpit. He never let me see them while he was alive. After he died, after the funeral in 1884, I went through his papers because I needed to know what he had owned, what he had owed, what kind of man he had been when no one was watching. I found these in a leather pouch under his bookshelf. There were 47 of them. Eli stared down at the letters in his hand. "I read them all in one night," she said. "I read them again the next night. I read them for the next 5 years. I read them when I could not sleep, and when I was afraid, and when the children at the school said something cruel, and when I felt that I was disappearing. I read them until I knew the man who had written them. I knew his voice. I knew his temper. I knew he had been to war. I knew he loved his mother. I knew his name." She paused. Her voice was very quiet. "Eli Kane," she said. "I have known your name for 5 years. I have whispered it to myself in empty rooms. When Ruth Hawthorne told me her oldest brother lived alone on a mountain above Cedar Hollow and his name was Eli Kane, my hands shook so hard I thought she would notice. I came up this mountain because of you. I told myself I came because I had nowhere else to go. But that was not true. I came because of you." Eli was holding the bundle of letters and now his hands were shaking. "But you," she said, "did not know me. You met me at the door and you looked at me as if I were a ghost, and then you looked at me as if you hated me, and I thought he has changed. 8 years has made him cold, or perhaps the man in those letters never existed, and my father lied not only by hiding them, but by letting me believe they were love. So I told myself I would stay 1 winter. I would not say my real name. I would call myself Bramwell, which was my grandmother's name, the only piece of my mother's family my father did not poison. I would stay until the thaw, and then I would walk down the mountain and disappear into the country, and I would never know whether the man who wrote those letters had truly loved me or whether I had imagined the whole of it. She stopped. Her eyes were wet now, but she did not cry. Eli set the letters down on the quilt. He went down off the chair onto his knees beside the bed. He put both his hands around her one hand, and he pressed his forehead against her knuckles, and he did not speak. He could not. There was no room left in him for words. She lifted her free hand and rested it on the back of his neck. She felt the silver in his hair. She felt the long ridge of the scar where it ran behind his ear. She closed her eyes and felt the weight of 8 years lift off her shoulders and settle down somewhere quiet, somewhere she would never have to carry it again. They sat like that for a long time. The fire in the front room snapped once softly, and Boone outside the door made a small, contented sound and laid his gray head down on his paws. When Eli finally spoke, his voice was not the voice of the cold man she had met on the porch. It was the voice of the man in the letters. "I will not lose you twice, Eleanor." She said, "No, you will not." Christmas Eve came on slow and clear and bright. The sky over the Wind River was hard and blue, and the smoke from the cabin chimney went straight up like a prayer that had been answered. Adelaide Larkin had ridden up that morning behind Silas, who had returned the day before from Cheyenne with a leather portfolio full of legal papers and a face gray with exhaustion. Adelaide came in with 2 pies, a wheel of cheese wrapped in cloth, and a finished knitted shawl in her hands, the wool a soft cream color, which she pressed into Eleanor's arms without ceremony. "Welcome," she said. "Welcome to the family, sister." Eleanor wept openly, and she did not try to hide it. She had not had a sister before. That night they had a feast such as the cabin had not seen in 9 years. Jasper had brought down a young buck 3 days earlier, and Eli had hung it in the smokehouse to age, and Silas had butchered it that morning. There was venison roasted with onions and dried sage. There was bread that Eleanor and Adelaide had baked together that afternoon, working side by side at the floured table, talking quietly the way women talk when they have just discovered they are going to be sisters in the same house. There was a pie made of dried apples and one made of canned peaches that Ruth had brought up. After supper, Jasper went to the corner and unwrapped the canvas from the banjo their father had carried west from Tennessee. He sat down on the hearth bench. He tuned it slowly. Then he began to play. He played a Christmas carol first, the one their mother had sung in Tennessee, and Adelaide joined in softly, and Silas hummed along. Then Jasper switched to another tune, an old one, a slow tune in 3/4 time, and he looked at Eli and he raised one eyebrow. Eli stood up. He crossed the room to Eleanor, who was sitting in the rocking chair by the fire with the cream-colored shawl around her shoulders. He held out his hand. She looked up at him, and she put down her cup, and she took his hand, and she stood, and he led her to the cleared space in the middle of the front room, where the rag rug had been pulled back. He put his right hand at her waist. He took her right hand in his left. He began to dance. It was a slow waltz. He had not danced in 8 years. She had never danced in her life because her father had taught her that dancing was a sin. But he led her gently, simply, and her feet found the rhythm by some old instinct she did not know she had. She looked up at him. "You dance well," she said. He said, "I learned it for our wedding. I asked the schoolmaster's wife in Miller's Crossing to teach me in the spring of '81. I did not think I would remember." She put her head against his chest. Adelaide pressed her face against Silas's shoulder and cried without making a sound. Ruth held one hand over her mouth and watched her oldest brother, who had lived for 8 years like a man slowly turning to stone, dance with a woman in the middle of the cabin floor, and she thought that she was watching a resurrection. Old Boone lay by the hearth, his tail moving slowly, his old gray head up to watch. That was the night the cabin became a home again. 2 days after Christmas, Silas rode down to Cedar Hollow with Adelaide so that she could begin preparing for their own wedding in the spring. He went also because Eli wanted information. In the saloon at the bottom of the main street, Silas had a beer and listened. The man with the tintype had been there for 3 days. He was a tall man in a black oilskin coat with 2 pistols on his hip and the empty-eyed flatness of a hired killer. He called himself Marcus Thorne. He said he was a private investigator out of Pennsylvania. He said he was looking for a missing school teacher named Eleanor Ashford, and he was offering money to anyone who could tell him where she had gone. Silas drank his beer slowly and did not look at Thorne. When Silas left the saloon, he walked out into the street, and he saw Thorne in conversation with a man Silas knew, an old miner named Brennan, who had once been kind to Silas as a boy. Silas saw Brennan point. Silas saw the direction Brennan's finger went. It went up the mountain trail. It went toward the cabin. Silas walked very calmly to the livery. He saddled his horse very calmly. He rode out of Cedar Hollow at a walk, and once he was past the last house and around the bend in the trail, he kicked his horse into a hard gallop and did not stop until he saw the smoke from the cabin chimney an hour later. He came in through the door without knocking. He did not take off his coat. He said, "Eli, he knows where she is." Brennan pointed him up the mountain. "He may already be on the road behind me." Eli looked at Eleanor. He looked at her for a long time. "Eleanor," he said, "I have to ask you a thing. I do not have the right to ask. The papers Silas brought back from Cheyenne are good. They will hold up in any court west of the Mississippi. But they will hold up faster, and they will hold up harder if you and I are married before your father gets here. If we are husband and wife under the law, he loses every claim of guardianship. He becomes only a stranger. He becomes only a criminal. But I will not," he said. "I will not put a ring on your hand because of a man riding up a mountain trail. I will not. So I am asking you for yourself. Will you marry me? Tonight. In this room. With my brothers and my sister as witnesses." Eleanor stood up out of her chair. She crossed the floor to him, and she took both of his hands in both of her hands, and she said, "Eli Kane, I have been waiting for someone to ask me what I wanted for 25 years. No one has ever asked me, not once. You are the first." She did not need to say her answer. He saw it in her face. That night, by the light of every lamp in the cabin, with Ruth beside Eleanor and Jasper beside Eli, with Silas reading the words from a small leather Bible their mother had carried, the two of them said the old vows in front of the fire. Eli took from his coat pocket a small gold band, plain, narrow, the kind a working man buys when he is still young enough to believe in luck. He had bought it in 1881 in Miller's Crossing the morning before the telegram came. He had carried it in his pocket every day for 8 years. He had never been able to bring himself to put it back in the trunk. He slid it onto her finger. It fit. When the words were finished, Silas wrote out a marriage record on a single sheet of vellum. They all signed. Ruth, Jasper, Silas, Adelaide. The names ran down the page like names on a deed. Then Silas folded the paper carefully and placed it inside the leather portfolio with the Cheyenne papers. Eli walked Eleanor to his own bedroom, the one on the eastern side of the cabin, the one with the small window that looked out over the pines. He had moved his things there that afternoon. He had cleaned the floor and sanded the windowsill and put fresh sheets on the bed. He had built up a fire in the small iron stove. Before they crossed the threshold, he stopped. He took the leather cord from around his neck, the one he had worn for 8 years. He unlocked the trunk at the foot of the bed. He lifted out the ivory portrait. He looked at it once, and then he walked to the stove and he opened the iron door and he laid the portrait inside on the burning logs. He said, "I do not need a picture anymore. I have you." The ivory caught and curled at the edges and turned dark. The face of the 16-year-old girl in the painting disappeared into smoke. Eleanor stood in the middle of the bedroom in her plain wool dress, and her hands trembled, and she was not afraid. She had been afraid every night of her life since she was 8 years old. She was not afraid of this man. She had never been afraid of him, not even on the first night when he had spoken so coldly at the door. He came to her. He cupped her face in both of his rough hands. He kissed her on the forehead first, the way a man kisses something holy. Then he kissed her properly, slowly, the way he had imagined kissing her 10,000 times in 8 years. Outside the window, the snow began to fall again, soft and slow, and it covered any tracks that anyone might have made on the trail leading up to the cabin. Just before sunrise, Jasper, who had taken the watch in the barn, heard a horse blow somewhere down the trail. He moved. He had not survived a dozen winters in the Wind River, and a youth spent tracking grizzly by being slow. He went out the back door of the barn into the woodpile, moving low, his rifle across his arms, and he flattened himself against the stack of split pine and waited. He saw 3 men come out of the trees at the bottom of the south meadow. They were on foot. They had left their horses below the ridge. They were spread in a loose line 10 yards apart, working slowly toward the cabin. The middle man was tall in a black oilskin coat. Marcus Thorne. Jasper raised his rifle. He called out in the carrying voice his father had taught him to use when shouting across a canyon. He said, "That is far enough." Thorne and his men dropped flat. Then they came up shooting. The first ball whined off the corner of the woodpile 6 inches above Jasper's head. He fired back. His shot took the man on the right through the chest and put him down in the snow. The man on the left scrambled behind a pine and began to fire steadily at the woodpile. Inside the cabin, Eli came up the ladder to the loft window in 3 steps. He had his Winchester at his shoulder before he reached the top. From the loft, he had a clean view of the south meadow. He picked the man behind the pine. He led him by half a length the way you lead a deer. He squeezed. The man behind the pine fell sideways into the snow and did not get up. Silas had taken the back. He came around the corner of the cabin in time to see Thorne rise out of the snow at 30 yards and swing his pistol up. Silas fired. The shot caught Thorne high in the thigh. Thorne went down screaming. For a moment the meadow was still except for the screaming. Then Thorne began to drag himself backward toward the trees. He shouted as he went. He shouted, "This is not finished. The girl belongs to her father under the law. I will bring the sheriff. I will bring her father himself. You cannot keep her up here." Then he reached the trees and dragged himself behind them, and they heard him crashing through the brush down toward the horses, and a few minutes later they heard one horse gallop off down the trail. Jasper came out from behind the woodpile slowly. There was blood on his coat sleeve halfway between elbow and shoulder. A ball had cut a long, shallow furrow across the meat of his arm. It was not deep, but it was bleeding hard. Eleanor was already moving when he came in through the door. She had heard the shooting from the bedroom. She had pulled on her dress and her shoes without ringing for help. She was waiting in the kitchen with a kettle of hot water and a clean linen towel, and when Jasper came in pale-faced, she pushed him into a chair and tore the sleeve of her own outer skirt clean off at the seam without hesitating, and she made a tourniquet above the wound with the linen and tied it tight. Eli watched her work. Her hands did not shake. Her face was composed. He had seen field surgeons in '76 who were less steady. "She is stronger than I thought," he said quietly to Silas. Silas, who was reloading his pistol at the table, did not look up. "Brother," he said, "she is married to a Cain now. She has to be." That afternoon, while Adelaide tended Jasper's arm and made him drink broth, the three brothers sat at the kitchen table and held counsel. Eli laid out the papers. The original letter from Reverend Cyrus Ashford, dated 1879, offering his daughter Eleanor in marriage to Eli Cain of the Wind River country, signed and sealed with the Reverend's own seal. The original telegram from June of 1881, which Eli had kept in his trunk for 8 years, in which Cyrus Ashford had announced his daughter's death. The marriage certificate from 2 nights ago, signed by 4 witnesses. The notarized statement Silas had brought back from Cheyenne, in which Caleb Henderson, a sitting circuit judge, had affirmed under his seal that all of the foregoing documents constituted prima facie evidence of fraud committed across state lines through the federal telegraph system. "If Cyrus Ashford comes up this mountain," Eli said, "we will not need to fire a single shot. The law will take him." Jasper, who was pale but smiling crookedly from the chair where Adelaide had propped him up, said, "Brother, he will come up this mountain. He has come too far not to." 2 nights later, while Silas was again away on an errand in town, Eli went out before dawn to check on a set of fresh tracks Jasper had spotted at the edge of the south meadow. Jasper, still feverish from his wound, was asleep in the loft. Adelaide had returned to her father's house to prepare the wedding. Eleanor was alone in the cabin with old Boone. She was not afraid. She had a small Colt revolver of Eli's on the kitchen table beside her, loaded, and she had the small knife Silas had forged for her tucked into the sash of her dress. She had banked the fire low. She had locked the front door and the back. She was sitting in the rocking chair near the hearth, reading from a book of poems by lamplight. Old Boone was asleep at her feet. Then he was not asleep. The old gray head came up off the floorboards. His ears went forward. A low growl, deeper than she had ever heard from him, came up out of his chest. Eleanor set down the book. Boone stood. He walked stiffly to the back door of the kitchen, and he stood with his nose almost touching the wood, and the growl was continuous now, a steady rumble that filled the cabin. She heard the sound, a small scratching, metal on metal. Someone was working at the back door lock with a pick. She picked up the Colt. She remembered what Jasper had taught her in the meadow the week before. Both hands. Thumb the hammer back before you point. She thumbed the hammer back. The click was loud in the kitchen. The lock gave. The back door swung inward. A man stepped through, a stranger she had never seen. Not Thorne, but someone Thorne had hired, a thin man in a wool greatcoat with a long knife already in his hand. He had not expected the dog. The dog was already in the air. Boone hit him at the chest. The man went down on his back, and Boone's old jaws closed on the sleeve of his knife arm, and the dog hung on the way Boone had hung onto a wounded buck once when he was 3 years old, with all the weight of him and all his old courage, and the man screamed and tried to roll. He brought the knife around with his free hand. Eleanor saw him do it. She fired the Colt straight up at the kitchen ceiling. The roar of the pistol in the small space was enormous. Plaster fell from the ceiling. The man on the floor froze for 1 second, which was enough. He shoved the dog off his chest with a great convulsive heave, and he ran out the back door into the dark, holding his torn arm against his side. Eleanor put the colt down on the table. Then she dropped to her knees beside Boone. The old dog was on his side. There was blood on his pale gray belly where the knife had gotten in once during the struggle. He looked up at her, and his tail thumped twice against the floorboards, slow and proud. She bent over him and held his head, and she wept into his fur. When Eli came back at first light and saw what had happened, he picked up the dog very gently and carried him into the front room and laid him on the rug by the hearth. Eleanor knelt beside Boone with a bowl of warm water and clean linen, and she cleaned the wound and packed it with the salve Adelaide had left, and Eli sat on the floor on the other side of the dog with his back against the stones of the hearth and his hand resting on the gray head. The wound was not as bad as it had looked. The knife had gone in shallow mostly through the loose skin of the belly. Boone would live. He would limp for the rest of his days, but he would live. Eli looked at his wife across the dog. He said he saved you. She said he saved me. Eli put his face down into his hand for a moment. Then, as the second wave was about to break over them, 2 days after the dog, and 1 day before the snow stopped, a wagon came up the trail. It came slowly. It was a large wagon, well-sprung, drawn by 4 matched bays, the kind of wagon that money rents and fear hires. 3 men rode beside it on horseback. One was Marcus Thorne, his thigh bandaged thick under his oilskin coat, his face bone white from blood loss but upright in the saddle. One was a man Eli did not know, but recognized by the silver star on his coat, the sheriff of Cedar Hollow County, and the third was a man in a dark traveling cloak and a high black hat, leaning on a silver-headed cane, gray and gaunt and sharp-eyed and very much not dead. Reverend Cyrus Ashford had come for his daughter. The wagon stopped at the edge of the south meadow. The 3 brothers were already on the porch. Eli was in the center, his Winchester in the crook of his arm. Jasper was on his right, his bandaged arm in a sling, but his good hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Silas was on his left. Behind them in the doorway stood Eleanor Kane, in a plain dark dress with old Boone limping, but on his feet beside her. The Reverend climbed down from the wagon with the careful slowness of an old man performing a part. He leaned on his cane. He looked up at the porch. "Eleanor," he called. His voice carried across the cold air. "Eleanor, my child, I have come a long way to find you. I was wrong, child. Your father was wrong. Come down to me. Come down and forgive your old father." Eleanor stepped 1 pace forward. She did not move past Eli, but she stepped forward. She said, "Hello, Father." The Reverend smiled. It was a smile that did not reach his eyes. Then she said, "You are not going to take me anywhere." The smile faltered. The sheriff of Cedar Hollow County coughed. "Mr. Kane, he said the gentleman here has documents that establish his guardianship of this young woman. He has the right to seek the return of his daughter through legal means. I am here only to ensure that there is no further bloodshed between your family and his agents. I do not want to use this office wrongly, but the law is the law. If she is unmarried and if her father is alive, then her place is with him." "Eli said, Sheriff, I am very glad you said that." He turned his head just slightly. He said, "Silas." Silas stepped forward. He held the leather portfolio. He came down the porch steps, and he walked across the trampled snow of the yard, and he stopped 10 feet from the sheriff, and he opened the portfolio. Sheriff Silas said, "I have here 4 documents. 1. A letter dated April 1879 from Reverend Cyrus Ashford to the Kane family, offering his daughter Eleanor in marriage to my brother. 2. A telegram dated June 1881, signed by Reverend Cyrus Ashford, claiming that his daughter Eleanor had died of fever and that there would be no marriage. 3. A marriage certificate dated December 30th, 1889, joining Eli Kane and Eleanor Ashford as husband and wife under the laws of the territory of Wyoming, signed and witnessed by 4 parties, including my sister, Ruth Kane Hawthorne. 4. A notarized statement from Judge Caleb Henderson of the Cheyenne Circuit, attesting that the foregoing telegram constitutes evidence of fraud committed across state lines through the Federal Telegraph System and constitutes additional evidence of fraudulent concealment in matters of property and inheritance. The Reverend was declared dead in 1884 in Pennsylvania Sheriff in order to escape his creditors. He has been alive this whole time. He has come back now because his daughter's silver mine in Colorado is about to come to market, and he requires her signature to sell it. He has no claim on her under any law of any state of this union. He never had. Silas held out the portfolio. The sheriff took it. He read for a long time in the cold with his breath making white plumes around the pages. Then he looked up at the Reverend. His face had changed. Reverend Ashford, the sheriff said. The Reverend's face had changed too. The mask was gone. What was left underneath was not a kindly old man at all. It was something older and harder and meaner, the face of a man who had spent his life telling other people what God required and who had never once asked himself the same question. He turned. He looked at Marcus Thorne in the saddle. He said very quietly, "Kill the husband." Thorne's hand went for his pistol. He never reached it. Jasper Kane, who had stood for 10 minutes on that porch with his right arm in a sling and his good hand resting on his pistol grip, drew left-handed. He drew faster than Thorne had ever seen a man draw in his life. The single shot broke the morning stillness like an axe falling on dry wood. Thorne's pistol hand jerked sideways, and his pistol went into the snow, and Thorne stared down at his own ruined wrist with an expression of pure surprise, as if he had never imagined in all his years that he might be the one who was not fast enough. The sheriff was off his horse in 2 steps, his own pistol drawn but pointing at the ground. He said, "Reverend Cyrus Ashford, you are under arrest for fraud across state lines, fraudulent concealment of life status in matters of inheritance, and conspiracy to commit murder. Marcus Thorne, you are under arrest for attempted murder and assault upon the persons of these citizens. The both of you will accompany me down this mountain." The Reverend went gray in the face. He tried to lean on his cane, and the cane slipped in the snow, and he went heavily down on one knee. Eleanor came down off the porch. She walked across the yard slowly, and she stopped 6 feet from her kneeling father, and she looked down at him with eyes that had no kindness left in them at all. She said, "My name is Eleanor Kane." He looked up. He opened his mouth. He said, "Eleanor, you will never be happy with that man. You will never be happy with that scarred man on his mountain." She said, "Father, the scar on that man's face is more beautiful than anything you ever gave me. Goodbye." She turned around. She walked back to the porch. She climbed the steps. She took her husband's hand. She did not look back at her father once, not as the sheriff put manacles on his wrists, not as they loaded him into the wagon, not as the wagon turned and started its slow descent down the mountain trail. The old Reverend was screaming her name as the wagon went around the bend in the pines. She did not hear him. She had stopped hearing him 8 years before, when he had locked her in her bedroom and told her she was dead. The cabin door closed behind them. The wagon disappeared around the bend in the pines, and for a long time after it was gone, no one inside the cabin moved. Then Jasper let out a slow breath and lowered his good hand from his pistol. He sat down heavily on the bench by the door because his bandaged arm had started to throb again from the recoil of his draw. Silas put both his hands flat on the kitchen table and bowed his head over them, and his shoulders shook, once the way a man's shoulders shake when he has been carrying a weight for too long and has finally been allowed to put it down. Ruth, who had been sitting in the rocking chair with her hands twisted together in her lap during the entire confrontation, stood up and came across the room and put her arms around Eleanor without saying a word, and the two women stood there in the middle of the front room and held each other, while old Boone limped between their skirts and pressed his old gray head against Eleanor's knee. Eli walked to the kitchen window. He stood looking out at the empty yard where the wagon had been. The trampled snow was already beginning to fill in. By morning there would be no sign that anyone had ever come up that trail at all. Jasper said, "Well, brother, I believe we just had the most memorable Christmas and New Year's any family in the Wind River country has had in some time." The laugh that came out of Eli was rough at first, like a tool that had not been used in years. But it came. And then Silas laughed too, and Ruth laughed half crying, and Eleanor laughed against Ruth's shoulder, and even Adelaide, who had come up from her father's house at first light when the news of the wagon had reached town, laughed in the doorway with a hand pressed to her mouth. It was the first time the cabin had heard real laughter in a long while. Adelaide made coffee for everyone. Eleanor cut bread. Silas built up the fire. Jasper sat with his arm in its sling and complained with great theatrical patience that he was the only one who had been shot twice in 3 weeks, and that no one was bringing him his coffee fast enough. Eleanor brought him his coffee. She kissed the top of his head when she set the cup down. Jasper went very still for a moment, and then he cleared his throat and said, "Sister," in a voice so quiet that the others did not quite hear it. But Eleanor heard it, and she put her hand on his good shoulder and squeezed once, and went back to the table. That night, after Ruth and Adelaide had ridden back down to Cedar Hollow, Eli and Eleanor sat alone by the fire. The cabin was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the quiet of a man living alone with a dog. It was the quiet of a house that had people in it breathing softly in different rooms, and that was a very different silence indeed. Eli sat in his chair with Boone at his feet and Eleanor in his lap. She had her head against his shoulder. She had let down her hair, and the autumn red of it spread across his shirt. He said very quietly, "I want you to know something." She said, "What?" He said, "For 8 years I told myself that the only thing I needed to do to be a man was to keep going, to get up in the morning, to split the wood, to feed the horses, to carry the rifle. I told myself a man who could do those things was still a man. I was wrong, Eleanor. A man who only does those things is not a man. He is a clock that has not yet stopped ticking. Tonight is the first night in 8 years that I feel like a man again and not a clock." She did not answer for a moment. Then she lifted her face and kissed the scar on his cheek, the long one that ran from his temple down to his jaw, and she kissed it slowly, the way one kisses something one has loved without being allowed to. She said then, "We have a great deal of time to make up for husband." 2 weeks after the wagon went down the mountain, a letter came up from Cedar Hollow. The letter had traveled a long way to reach the cabin. It had been written in Philadelphia by a firm of attorneys, then sent by rail to Cheyenne, then carried by stagecoach to Cedar Hollow, then handed to Ruth's husband at his store, and then carried up the mountain by Silas, who arrived on a clear, cold morning in mid-January, with the letter in his coat pocket and his cheeks red from the wind. He set it on the kitchen table and pushed it across to Eleanor. "It is from Pennsylvania," he said. "The seal is from a law firm there." I did not open it. Eleanor sat down. She broke the seal with the small forging knife Silas had made her, the one she had taken to carrying with her as a matter of habit even inside the cabin. She unfolded the paper. It was 3 pages long, written in a small, careful clerical hand. She read it once in silence. Then she read it again. Then she handed it to Eli. The first page reported that on January 8, 1890, in the County Court of Allegheny, Pennsylvania, one Cyrus Ashford, formerly of Greenbrier in the same state, had been arraigned on charges of mail fraud, telegraph fraud across state lines, fraudulent concealment of life status, conspiracy to commit murder, and 7 counts of related lesser fraud committed against various creditors between the years 1884 and 1889. He had pleaded not guilty. The court, having reviewed the documentary evidence presented by the Office of the United States Marshal of the Wyoming Territory, had remanded the defendant without bail. The trial had concluded on January 23rd. The defendant had been found guilty on every count. He had been sentenced to 15 years in the state penitentiary. The second page reported that the silver mine in San Juan County, Colorado, registered in trust to the late Margaret Calloway Ashford, and her surviving heir, Eleanor Ashford, was now the unencumbered property of Eleanor Ashford Kane. The trust had been dissolved by order of the court on the same day as the conviction. A check made out in the amount of $9,480, representing the present cash value of the mine after fees and back taxes, was enclosed. The third page was a personal note from one of the attorneys, a man named Hollister, who wrote that he had known Eleanor's mother slightly in his youth, that he had always thought poorly of the Reverend, and that he wished her every happiness in her new life in the West. Eleanor sat very still at the table. She was not crying. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were on the check. After a long while she said, "Eli." He said, "Yes." She said, "This is my mother's, not mine, not father's, my mother's. She bought that mine with her own inheritance from her father when she was 20 years old. She bought it because she wanted something that was hers. She wanted something her husband could not take. He took it anyway, of course. He took everything, but it was always hers." She slid the check across the table to him. "You decide," she said. "You are my husband." He pushed it gently back to her. "No," he said. "No. You decide. It is your mother's. It is yours." Eleanor sat with the check in front of her for a full week. She slept on it. She walked with it in her pocket up to the ridge where the empty grave had once stood. She read her mother's old letters by the firelight. She did not speak of it. On the 8th morning she came down to the kitchen at first light, and she said to Eli, who was lacing his boots by the door, "I have decided." He stopped lacing. She said, "I want to build a school in Cedar Hollow, a new one, a proper one, with a stove that does not smoke and books and slates for every child and a roof that does not leak." "The miners are coming back," Silas says. "The new copper claim on the south side will bring families. There will be children. I want to teach them. When our own children are old enough, I will go down the mountain 3 days a week, and I will teach." Eli looked at her for a long time. He said, "Eleanor Kane, you are the kindest person I have ever known in my life." She said, "No. I am only a person who knows what it is to be a child whose mother is gone, and whose father is cruel, and who has nothing to read but the Bible. I do not want any child in Cedar Hollow to grow up the way I did." He stood up from his boots. He came across the kitchen. He took her face in both his hands and he kissed her on the forehead and then on the mouth, and he said, "Build your school, wife, build it tomorrow." She wrote a letter to the attorney Hollister that afternoon. By spring, the foundation of the new schoolhouse had been laid on a piece of flat ground at the edge of Cedar Hollow, donated by Ruth's husband, paid for in full by Eleanor Kane, who had once been Eleanor Ashford and once been Nora Bramwell, and was finished with both of those names forever. Late in February, on a clear, cold afternoon, when the sun was bright, but the wind off the peaks was still cutting, Eli and Jasper sat on the porch of the cabin with their pipes. Jasper's arm had healed enough that he no longer needed the sling. He could draw a pistol again, although he did not draw it as fast as he had in the yard that morning, and he claimed with great cheerfulness that he was content to go through the rest of his days at second best. The two of them sat watching Silas in the meadow below the cabin, where Silas was working a young horse on a long lead, walking it in slow, patient circles. Eleanor sat on the corral fence in a heavy wool coat that had been her mother-in-law's and now was hers, watching Silas work. From the porch, she was a small, dark shape against the white meadow, but Eli could see even from that distance the way she sat very straight, the way Ruth Kane Hawthorne had once sat as a young girl learning to ride. Jasper drew on his pipe. He let the smoke out slowly. He said, "Brother, do you remember the day Father died?" Eli said, "Every day." Jasper said, "I never told you what he said to me on his last morning. I do not know why. I think I did not have the words. He was very weak by then. He could only whisper. He took my hand, and he pulled me down close so he could speak into my ear, and he said this. He said, 'Jasper, look after your brother. Eli is not as hard as he pretends. His heart is the easiest to break of any heart in this house. Look after him for me.' Eli did not move. Jasper said, 'I did not understand it then. I was 25 years old. I thought you were the strongest man I had ever known. I thought Father was confused by the fever. But 6 months later, when the telegram came and I watched what it did to you, I understood. And I have been doing what he asked me to do for 8 years, brother, as best as a younger brother can.' Eli was quiet for a long time. Then he said, 'Jasper, I would not have lived through those 8 years without you and Silas. I want you to know that. There were nights in those first 2 winters when I did not know if I would still be here in the morning. And it was the sound of you and Silas in the next room, you arguing over the cards, you laughing at something stupid Silas said, that kept me here. That sound. Every night. Thank you.' Jasper did not answer. He took his pipe out of his mouth and looked at the bowl of it. After a while he reached over with his good arm and put his hand on his older brother's shoulder, and he left it there for a long count, and then he took it away. That was the most they had ever said to each other in their lives. That was the most they would ever say. Neither of them needed any more. The thaw came late that year. The first true thaw was at the end of March, almost into April. The snow on the south meadow began to drop in soft, heavy slabs off the pines. The trail down to Cedar Hollow turned to mud, and then to mud over ice, and then to good packed earth again, and small green shoots came up through the dead grass at the edge of the corral. It was on one of those bright, thawing mornings that Eleanor went out onto the porch with her coffee, and she called for Boone. The old dog did not come. She called again, and then she set the coffee down on the railing and went down the porch steps in her shawl. Boone was an old dog now, old beyond what most of his breed lived, and on warm mornings he had taken to lying in the small, clear space under the old pine on the ridge above the cabin, the place that had once held a stone with a name carved on it. She walked up the path through the wet patches and the half-melted snow. She found him there. He was lying on his side beneath the old pine in the place where the stone had stood. His paws were tucked the way he tucked them when he slept. His old gray muzzle was resting on the ground. His eyes were closed. She knew before she touched him. She knelt down in the wet earth and she put her hand on the side of his ribs, and there was no breath under her palm. She did not weep at first. She only put her face down against his neck and breathed in the smell of him, the smell of wood smoke and pine and old dog, and she stayed there for a long time. When she walked back down to the cabin, Eli saw her face, and he set down his coffee cup very gently, and he did not ask. He only put on his coat and went up the path with her. He knelt beside the old dog. He put his hand on the gray head. He stayed like that for a long time. He said very softly, "Thank you, old man. You waited. You waited until I found her. You can rest now." He did not weep, but his shoulders shook once, and Eleanor came and put her arms around him from behind and held him. They buried Boone that afternoon at the foot of the old pine in the same earth that had once been broken for the empty grave. Eli took down the stone with Eleanor's name on it. He did not break it. He simply lifted it out of the ground, and he carried it down the slope, and he walked it a long way through the trees until he came to a small ravine, and he laid it down there gently, the way one lays down a thing one has loved but no longer needs. He came back up the slope. He took Silas's chisel and a fresh flat stone from the stack by the smithy, and he carved a new inscription on the new stone. The carving took him 3 days. When he was finished, the new stone read, "Old Boone, watchman of the cane cabin, truest friend a man ever had." He set it under the old pine in the place where the empty grave had once been, where the old dog now slept. The double wedding was held on the second Saturday of June, 1890, in the meadow behind the cabin. The wildflowers had come in early that year. The lupines were blue across the south slopes, and the Indian paintbrush burned red along the fence line, and the high grass was dotted with the small white blossoms of a flower whose name Eleanor did not know, but which Eli told her was called bridal heather by the old-timers, and which made her laugh. The circuit preacher came up from Cedar Hollow on the Friday afternoon. He was a thin gray man named Reverend Whitfield, who had buried Eleanor's mother-in-law 9 years earlier, and who had married Ruth and her husband, and who, when he saw Eli waiting at the simple wooden arch Silas had built, took off his hat and held it against his chest for a long moment before he could speak. "I have lived to see a number of unlikely things," the preacher said quietly to no one in particular, "but I never thought to see Elias Kane take a wife." Adelaide Larkin, who was to marry Silas in the same ceremony, came up the mountain with her father and 3 of her sisters in the Saturday morning sun. She wore a pale blue dress that her mother had worn at her own wedding 27 years before, and she carried a bundle of white flowers tied with twine. She and Eleanor dressed together in the front room of the cabin, while Ruth braided their hair, taking equal care with each telling each of them in turn the small, old, foolish things that older women tell brides on the morning of weddings, things about the right way to fold a fitted sheet, and the wrong way to argue with a husband, and the necessity every spring of forgiving the man you married for being the same man you married last year. Eleanor's dress was a cream-colored gown that Ruth and Adelaide had sewed for her over 6 weeks, working together at Ruth's kitchen table down in Cedar Hollow. It was a simple dress. There was no veil. Eleanor had refused the veil. She said she had spent enough of her life with her face hidden. She wore her hair down, the autumn red of it falling free around her shoulders and into the loose braid at the crown of her head. Adelaide had tucked a single small dried sprig of edelweiss, the same kind of flower Eli had carried up the ridge once a month for 8 years. When the two brides came out of the cabin and walked side by side down the path toward the meadow, Jasper, who was standing by the arch with his pistol on his hip and his good arm clasped across his chest, said very softly, "Brother." Eli looked. He saw her coming. He saw the cream of the dress and the autumn red of the hair and the small white flowers in her arms, and he saw just above her left ear the dried edelweiss. Something inside him that had been holding on for 9 years simply let go. He did not weep. He had wept in his life only twice as a man, and this was not to be a third. But his face changed. The hard set of it, the set he had carried since the platform at Miller's Crossing, simply softened, and underneath it was the face of the young man he had been at 25, the young man who had written letters to a girl in Pennsylvania and meant every word of them. When she reached the arch, Reverend Whitfield, who had begun many ceremonies in his long life, paused before he began this one, and he said, looking out at the small gathered crowd of family and townsfolk, "If any here present know any reason why these two couples should not be lawfully wed, let him speak now or hereafter hold his peace." There was a silence. Then Jasper Kane said in a voice that carried across the meadow, "I object." Every head turned. Every head. Jasper grinned. He said, "Your Honor, I object on the grounds that these two should have been married 8 years ago, and I have been waiting all this time for my brother to marry someone, anyone, so that I could finally have a sister in this house who can cook better than he can. I move that the court overlook the delay and proceed with the wedding before he has any further opportunity to drag his feet." The meadow erupted in laughter. Even the preacher laughed. Eleanor laughed so hard she had to lean against Eli's arm to stay upright. Silas wiped his eyes. Adelaide laughed and slapped Silas on the shoulder. The vows came after the laughter the way the deepest things often do. Eli said, "Eleanor Ashford Kane, I waited 8 years for you when I thought you were dead. I will stand beside you every day from this one until the day I am truly gone. Every day of those years of silence taught me how precious you are. I will never again let you go." Eleanor said, "Eli Kane, I read your letters 1,000 times in 8 years, and I loved a man I had never met. When I came up this mountain and I saw you drop your knife on the table at the sound of a name I knew that I had come home. I will stand beside you to my last breath and after." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, when he said with the same words that Silas and Adelaide were also husband and wife, Jasper Kane raised his pistol skyward and fired one celebratory shot into the blue sky above the meadow, and the echo of it rolled along the Wind River for a long way, and far down on the south slope, an old buck who had been grazing at the edge of the timber lifted his head once, and then went calmly back to feeding. There was an empty chair at the edge of the gathering. On the chair, folded carefully, was a blue wool blanket the color of the deep summer sky. It had been old Boone's favorite. No one had to explain why the chair was there. That night, after the dancing and the eating and the long table that had been set up out under the pines and lit with hung lanterns, After the sisters had hugged Eleanor and the brothers-in-law had clasped Eli's hand and the preacher had ridden back down the mountain with a slice of cake wrapped in cloth, Eli walked his wife back to the cabin alone. He had spent the last weeks remaking the bedroom on the eastern side of the cabin. He had whitewashed the walls. He had built a new bed with Silas's help from clean pine. He had hung curtains of Eleanor's choosing. He had laid down a new rag rug in front of the small iron stove. He had cut and dried wildflowers and put them in a jar on the windowsill. Eleanor stood in the middle of the room when he opened the door for her. She had her hands clasped in front of her. She was not afraid. She had never once been afraid of him, not even on the first night when his coldness had hurt her. He stood for a long moment at the small window looking out at the moon over the Wind River. He said, "Do you know that I dreamed about this night 1,000 times?" She said, "Did you?" He said, "Every night for 8 years. I dreamed about standing in this room with you. And every morning for 8 years I woke up alone." She walked to him. She put her hand on his arm. She said then, "Tonight, husband, do not let the dream end." The moon came in through the small window and laid its light across the floorboards in a long, pale rectangle. Outside on the ridge above the cabin, a pair of coyotes called once across the pines and then fell silent. The high country slept. The first child came in the spring of 1891. It was a girl. They named her Margaret after Eleanor's mother. She was born in the bedroom on the eastern side of the cabin with Adelaide acting as midwife and Ruth sitting at her sister-in-law's head, holding her hand through the long hours, and Eli pacing the front room until Adelaide came out and put the small wrapped bundle in his arms, and his hands, which had held a Winchester on the rosebud and an axe through 1,000 winters, suddenly did not know what to do. "She is so small," he said. Adelaide said, "She will grow." He carried her into the bedroom. He sat down beside Eleanor, who was tired and pale and smiling, and he laid the baby in the crook of her mother's arm, and he sat there looking at the two of them for a long time without speaking. Finally, Eleanor said, "Eli, do you remember what you said to me that morning on the porch?" He said, "I have said many things to you on many porches, wife." "Which morning?" She said, "The morning after the wagon went down the mountain. You said that you had spent 8 years being a clock that had not yet stopped ticking. You said you had forgotten how to be a man." He said, "I remember." She looked down at the small face in the crook of her arm. She said, "Look, we are not clocks, husband, not anymore." He bent down. He kissed his wife's forehead, and then he kissed his daughter's, and he stayed there with his face close to both of them for a long time. A month after Margaret was born, on a clear, bright April morning, Eleanor went out onto the porch of the cabin with the baby in her arms. Eli came up behind her and put his arms around her from behind, and he rested his chin gently on the top of her head, and they stood there together, looking out at the meadow. Below them, in the south pasture, Silas and Adelaide were planting a kitchen garden. Adelaide herself was now expecting dew in late summer, and her hand kept going to the small curve of her belly, the way a woman's hand always does. Jasper was working a young horse in the corral, and beside him, lying watchfully in the spring grass, was a young gray hound, a half-grown pup, that the people of Cedar Hollow had presented to Eli at Christmas, with a card that read, "For Mr. Kane, of the line of Old Boone, who saved the schoolteacher." The pup had Boone's gray coat and Boone's quiet eyes, and he was already at 6 months old, following Eli everywhere he went. Ruth was inside the cabin with her own husband, who had come up for the weekend, and they were laughing about something in the kitchen. Eleanor turned her head. She looked up at her husband. She said, "Eli, tell me the truth. Do you regret the 8 years we lost?" Eli looked down at her. He looked at the baby in her arms. He said, "No, I do not. I will tell you why. Every night of those 8 years I knelt in the snow before that stone on the ridge, and I made the same promise to God. I said, 'Lord, if you bring her back to me, I will never let her go again. I will never take a single day of her for granted. I will be the husband I should have been the first time.' The 8 years taught me how to keep that promise. If I had married you in 1881, I would have been a good husband, but I would have been a young one. I would have been hurried. I would have been distracted. I would have forgotten on 100 Tuesdays to say thank you. I do not forget any more, Eleanor. The 8 years are the price I paid to learn how to love you the way you deserved to be loved. I would pay it again. I would pay it 10 times. She did not answer. She only laid her head back against his chest, and she felt his heartbeat under her ear, steady and strong and very much alive. The sun came up over the eastern ridge and laid a long bar of gold across the cabin porch. Down below them, Jasper laughed at something Silas had said. The young greyhound stood up in the grass and shook himself and trotted toward the corral. A horse blew softly somewhere down the slope. Inside the cabin, Ruth's voice and her husband's voice mingled with the soft clatter of cups in the kitchen. The Wind River country in the spring of 1891 was full of small, ordinary sounds, the sounds a family makes on a quiet morning, when no one is dying, no one is leaving, and no one is coming up the trail with a gun. Some men build empires. Some men accumulate fortunes. Eli Kane had built something he believed was worth more than any of those things. He had built a family, a wife who had been buried for 8 years and had walked up out of the grave on a December morning and into his arms. 2 brothers who had stood on the porch beside him with their rifles and would have stood there until the last bullet was gone if it had come to that. A sister who had brought him his salvation in a wagon through a snowstorm. A daughter sleeping in her mother's arms in the spring sun. An old gray dog buried under the pine on the ridge, and a young one growing into the place the old one had left. In the high country of Wyoming Territory in those last years of the old Wild West, the richest man was not the man with the most silver. The richest man was the man with the most people who would have died for him, and the most people he would gladly have died for in return. By that measure, Elias Kane was the richest man in Wyoming. The camera, if there had been one, would have pulled back then, back from the porch, back over the south meadow where Silas and Adelaide knelt in the freshly turned earth, back over the corral where Jasper stood with one boot on the lower rail, watching the young horse circle, back over the cabin chimney with its slow blue ribbon of wood smoke, back up the slope to the old pine on the ridge where a single gray stone bore the name of an old dog who had once saved a young woman in the kitchen and who slept now in the same earth that had once held an empty grave with a different name on it. The sun cleared the ridge. The light spread across the high meadows. A young hound barked once in the distance. A horse answered. The end.